So now we get to talk about the inverse trig functions, secant, cosecant, and cotangent. Again, let's just quickly talk about their ranges. Inverse cosecant, which is the reciprocal of sine, has a range similar to inverse sine, except we also have to restrict y cannot be 0, because at 0, inverse cosecant is undefined. Inverse secant, which is the reciprocal, secant is the reciprocal of cosine, so its range is also similar to inverse cosine. However, we have to not include pi over 2 because at pi over 2 cosecant is undefined. But they're very similar, so that's what I want you to keep in mind. However, inverse cotangent, which is the reciprocal of tangent, its range is not similar. And if you can think of the graph of cotangent, the first asymptote, we have 0 to pi as the asymptote. So that's where we would restrict the range, so from 0 to pi. So let's solve some of these problems. All right, so I got a couple examples up here. What is inverse cosecant of square root of 2? Well, I think the easiest thing for me is to think of the reciprocal, or maybe you have cosecant squared. When is cosecant equal square root of 2 memorized by now? But I would think of when is sine equal to 1 over square root of 2, which is square root of 2 over 2, right? And that you would say is pi over 4. And the range for cosecant is almost the same as the range for inverse sine. So from pi over 2 to negative pi over 2. This is positive, so it's not very confusing. It's in the first quadrant at 45 degrees. Okay, so what about inverse secant of negative a half? To do this problem, I would think, okay, secant is a reciprocal of cosine, so I'll think of inverse cosine of the reciprocal of negative 2 is negative 1/2. When is cosine equal to a half? That would be at 60 degrees, otherwise known as pi over 3. But the range of secant is the same as almost the same as the inverse cosine range. The range of inverse secant is almost the same as the range of inverse cosine. So we have to be in the second quadrant with a reference angle of pi over 3. And that would be 2 pi over 3. And the last one, inverse cosine of negative square root of 3 over 3. Again, I don't know my cotangent and tangent that well, but I know that's got to be 30 or 60. So when would the square root of 3 be in the denominator? So at 60, it would be adjacent over opposite. Adjacent, that's cotangent. Adjacent over opposite, and square root of 3 would be in the denominator. So that is pi over 3. But you have to remember that inverse cotangent is sort of like inverse cosine. It's from 0 to pi, so we'll be in the second quadrant with a reference angle of pi over 3. And that is also 2 pi over 3.